Have you ever set your alarm for 5 a.m. with the burning desire to change your life, only to hit snooze until 8 o'clock and wake up drenched in guilt? Maybe you've heard that the world's most successful people win their day before the sun rises. Yet every time you try, you retreat into old habits. You tell yourself, I'm just not a morning person, clinging to the comfort of your sheets while your potential slips away. But what if I told you that by sleeping through the dawn, you are essentially living your life backwards? While the world moves forward, you remain stagnant, drifting through a reality you never chose. What if the ultimate price you are refusing to pay, the simple sacrifice of 1 hour of comfort, is the only thing standing between you and the destiny you crave? One man's story proves that when you stop escaping your life and start confronting it at 5 a.m., you gain a power that no amount of luck can provide. Stay with me, because your future is decided before the sun rises. And this is the wake-up call you've been waiting for. In a quiet corner of a city that never stops moving, Petra lived in the shadows of a reality the world chose to ignore. His home was a small, cramped room where the air felt heavy with the scent of damp concrete and the lingering exhaustion of 1,000 long days. The walls were a map of his struggles, covered in jagged cracks that seemed to deepen with every passing month, mirroring the lines beginning to etch themselves around his sunken eyes. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling by a frayed wire, its dim, flickering glow barely reaching the corners of the room, casting long, lonely shadows across his minimal furniture. Petra was a man in his late 20s, yet he carried the weariness of someone twice his age. His face was a portrait of quiet endurance, marked by a faint stubble and a gaze that had seen many doors close. He came from a world of absolute poverty, where life had denied him the luxury of connections or the safety net of second chances. His clothes were thin and faded, and his shoes, though kept clean with meticulous care, bore the unmistakable holes of someone who had walked miles in search of a break that never came. Every evening, as the city began its neon-lit ascent into the night, Petra felt the crushing weight of his ordinary world. To the people in the clean shirts heading to office jobs or the families gathering behind brightly lit windows, he was invisible, a ghost in the machinery of the town. Inside his room, there were no luxuries, only the bare necessities for survival. A small wooden table, a single chair, and a cheap alarm clock that sat like a silent sentry by his bed. The exhaustion he felt wasn't just physical. It was a soul-deep fatigue born from the realization that he was working hard just to stay in the same place. He felt trapped in a survival loop, a cycle of effort that yielded no progress, leaving him to wonder if these cracked walls would be the boundaries of his existence forever. Outside, the skyline represented a distant, unreachable success, but inside the silence of his room, Petra harbored a quiet hope that refused to be extinguished. Though his body was worn and his circumstances were dire, he was not yet broken. He was a man who had lost many battles, but as he sat in the flickering light of his single bulb, he knew he was not yet ready to surrender the war. He was simply waiting for the moment when his sacrifice would finally begin to outweigh his despair. The turning point arrived not with a thunderclap, but in the heavy, suffocating silence of a Tuesday morning. Petra sat on the edge of his thin mattress, his head buried in his calloused hands. The flickering light bulb above him finally gave out, plunging the room into a darkness that felt symbolic of his entire existence. For years, he had treated sleep as his only sanctuary, a temporary death where the debt collectors, the hunger, and the sight of his own threadbare life couldn't follow him. He realized then that he had been using his bed as a hiding place, a soft grave where he buried his potential every single night. He was tired of being a spectator to his own tragedy, exhausted by the soon and maybe that never arrived. He reached out in the dark and felt the cold plastic of his cheap alarm clock. It was a small, fragile thing, yet it held the keys to the only territory he had left to conquer, the 2 hours before the world claimed his energy. He understood that to change his life, he had to pay the ultimate price, not in currency, for he had none, but in the sacrifice of the only comfort he possessed. He had to kill the version of himself that prioritized rest over progress. He had to stop escaping reality and start outworking it. With a trembling hand, Petra set the dial. 500. The click of the mechanism sounded like a hammer hitting a nail, sealing a covenant between the man he was and the man he intended to become. He didn't just set an alarm. He declared a private war against his own limitations. He knew the coming dawn would bring a physical agony, a deep protest from a body already pushed to its limits. He knew his mind would scream for the snooze button, offering 1,000 logical reasons to stay under the covers. But as he lay back down for a final few hours of old life sleep, a new kind of fire flickered in his chest. The decision was made. He would no longer walk home while others woke up to their dreams. He would be the one awake while the world was still dreaming. He was done waiting for a hero or a stroke of luck that was never coming. If his life was a house falling apart, he would spend the dark, quiet hours of the morning rebuilding the foundation, one brick of discipline at a time. As the clock ticked toward 5, Petra didn't feel fear. For the first time in his late 20s, beneath the quiet exhaustion, he felt the cold, hard steel of resolve. He was ready to pay the price. He was ready to wake up. When the alarm finally pierced the stillness at 5 a.m., it didn't feel like a beginning. It felt like an assault. Petra's body, already brittle from years of labor and poor sleep, rebelled with a violence he hadn't expected. His limbs felt as heavy as lead, and his mind, clouded by the seductive fog of exhaustion, spun a web of rationalizations. It whispered that he was sick, that he had worked too hard the day before, or that one more hour of sleep was a biological necessity he couldn't afford to ignore. The mattress, though thin and worn, felt like the only warm place in a cold, indifferent world. But Petra forced himself into the biting air of the room. The first week was a war of silence, fought in the dim glow of his single light bulb. There were no cheers for his discipline, no audience for his struggle, only the rhythmic ticking of the clock and the hollow ache in his chest. As he sat at his small wooden table, his eyes would often drift shut, his head nodding toward the surface of the wood. Each time, he would jar himself awake, splashing cold water on his face until his skin stung. He was paying the ultimate price in the currency of discomfort. The mental struggle was even more grueling than the physical fatigue. In the quiet of the dawn, his deepest insecurities surfaced. The silence was a mirror that reflected his poverty, his lack of connections, and the sheer audacity of a man like him trying to rewrite a destiny that seemed set in stone. He felt the sting of social isolation. While others his age spent their evenings in the warmth of companionship and their mornings in the luxury of rest, Petra chose the lonely path of the student. He rejected the comfort of the snooze button and the temporary escape of dreams to confront the harsh reality of his own ignorance. He began to treat these hours as sacred ground, a crucible period where his old self was being systematically dismantled. He stared at borrowed books and old tutorials until the words blurred, forcing his mind to absorb skills that felt foreign and impossible. It was a period of agony where the results were invisible, and the only reward was the knowledge that he hadn't surrendered. Yet, slowly the resentment began to fade. By the third week, the war of silence shifted. The physical protest grew quieter, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. He was no longer a victim of his alarm clock. He was its master. In the stillness of those lonely mornings, Petra realized that the silence wasn't his enemy. It was the space where his new life was being built, one painful, disciplined second at a time. As the 90-day mark approached, a subtle but profound shift began to occur within the four walls of Petra's room. The heavy, suffocating air of stagnation was replaced by a quiet, electric sense of momentum. For weeks, he had been building a skill bridge, using his 2 morning hours to study complex data systems and logistics, and for the first time, the unreachable skyline of the city no longer felt like a taunt, felt like a destination. The magic hours between 5 o'clock and 7 a.m. had moved from a time of agonizing discipline to a time of creative power. He was no longer just a man trying to survive. He was a man constructing a future that the world had never intended for him. The transition from studying to winning manifested in the way Petra carried himself through the streets. The quiet exhaustion in his eyes was replaced by a sharp, focused clarity. One morning, As the first rays of the sun began to illuminate his small wooden table, Petra realized he was no longer struggling to understand the material. He was mastering it. The data patterns and accounting principles that once looked like a foreign language now felt like tools in his hands. He began to apply this new perspective to his meager surroundings, finding ways to optimize his own small life with the same precision he used in his studies. The distance between his cracked walls and the shimmering towers outside began to shrink. He started reaching out, applying his newfound knowledge to entry-level opportunities that required the exact technical proficiency he had forged in the dark. During his morning walks, he no longer looked at the men in clean shirts with envy, but with the calm recognition of a peer. He had spent months getting an edge while the world slept, gaining the equivalent of extra months of productive life through his sacrifice. This was the sunrise shift, the moment when the internal transformation became so undeniable that the external world had no choice but to respond. The city's opportunities, once distant whispers, were now becoming loud and clear. He could see the bridge he had built, stone by stone. Through every morning he chose the wooden table over the mattress. Petra wasn't just waiting for a change anymore. He had become the change. As he sat at his table one final morning before heading out to an interview he had secured through sheer persistence, he watched the sun climb over the horizon. The light didn't just touch the city. It filled his room, reflecting off the cheap alarm clock that had been his only witness. The war of silence was over, and the era of his new destiny was finally beginning to break. 1 year later, the cracked walls of the past had been replaced by the clean, sturdy lines of a new reality. Petra stood in a spacious two-bedroom apartment, watching the morning light flood through large windows that offered a panoramic view of the city he once thought unreachable. In the kitchen, the sound of tea brewing and the gentle hum of a modern heater replaced the flickering light bulb and the broken fan of his memory. He had successfully moved his mother from the countryside, providing her with the medical care and comfort he had once only been able to promise in whispers. Petra was no longer the invisible man in the shadows. He had become a lead strategist at a top firm, a position he secured not through luck, but because he possessed a level of discipline and a suite of skills that made him indispensable. The ultimate price he had paid in those lonely, silent mornings had been exchanged for a currency that never depreciates: self-mastery. His face still carried the marks of his journey. The sunken eyes had filled with life, but the quiet determination in his gaze remained, a permanent reminder of the war he had won in the dark. Every morning, the cheap plastic alarm clock still sat on his bedside table. At 5 a.m., it would ring, and Petra would rise with the same unwavering resolve. He no longer woke up early because he was desperate to escape poverty. He woke up because those 2 hours were his most sacred possession. They were the hours where he continued to build, to learn, and to plan. Success, he realized, was not a final destination he had reached, but a daily practice that required constant renewal. He understood that the difference between where a person is and where they want to be isn't talent or connections. It is how they use the quiet hours when the rest of the world is still dreaming. As the sun climbed over the horizon, illuminating a life rewritten by choice and courage, Petra looked at his reflection. He saw a man who had confronted reality one painful morning at a time and, in doing so, had claimed his destiny. He knew that as long as he won the morning, he would always win his life. The sacrifice had been great, but the transformation was eternal. The sunrise no longer saw a poor man in a small room. It saw a master of his own soul, standing tall in the light of a future he had forged with his own hands.